Have you ever wondered why happiness feels so fleeting? Why the things you hold dear, the people you love, the dreams you chase, even the moments you treasure, always seem to slip through your fingers, no matter how tightly you hold on? It's almost cruel, isn't it? We spend our lives chasing after permanence in a world that was never built to last. A father watches his children grow up, and one day, they're no longer little. A young woman falls in love, swearing forever, only to find that forever was shorter than she thought. A man builds a name for himself, gathers wealth, respect, admiration, and then in the blink of an eye it fades. And in those moments, when what we believed would remain suddenly vanishes, we feel lost, betrayed by life itself. But here's the truth no one tells you. It was never meant to stay. Not your success, not your youth, not your relationships, not even the emotions rising and falling within you. Everything is changing, every single moment. And the irony is, the more you cling, the more it hurts when things inevitably shift. This is where ancient wisdom speaks louder than modern noise. For over 2,500 years, the Buddha pointed to a simple, undeniable truth: impermanence. In Pali, it's called Anicca. It isn't a belief. It isn't a philosophy to debate over coffee. It's the nature of everything you've ever known, everything you'll ever lose, and everything you've yet to become. It's the reason your happiest moments don't last forever. It's the reason your worst days eventually pass. And it's the one truth that, if you truly see it, will free you from the invisible weight you didn't even realize you were carrying. You see, most people live under the illusion that if they can just get it right, if they find the right partner, the perfect job, the ideal home, the flawless version of themselves, then they'll be happy and stay happy. They spend years chasing, hoarding experiences and people, terrified of losing what little joy they've gathered. But what if it's not about gathering? What if the secret to peace isn't in holding on, but in learning how to let go? A leaf falls from a tree in autumn. It doesn't resist the wind, doesn't curse the season. It lets itself be carried. And maybe, somewhere deep down, it understands something we forget. Nothing is meant to stay, and that's okay. The Buddha once said, "Whatever is subject to arising is subject to ceasing." This isn't meant to make you sad. It's meant to wake you up. Because the very fact that everything changes is what makes this life so precious. Imagine if you knew for certain that today was the last time you'd hear your favorite song, or watch the sun melt into the horizon, or hold the hand of someone you love. You wouldn't scroll past it. You wouldn't waste it in distraction. You would be fully here, fully alive. And perhaps that's the gift of impermanence, the quiet reminder that now is the only moment you ever truly own. It urges you to stop living on autopilot, stop waiting for some perfect future, and start paying attention to the fragile, fleeting beauty around you. Because within that beauty lies freedom. Not the freedom to control the world, but the freedom to no longer be controlled by it. So, if you've ever felt the ache of something slipping away, if you've watched your reflection age in the mirror, if you've tasted both the sweetness of joy and the bitterness of grief, you're not broken. You're simply waking up to the way things truly are. And this, right here, is where real wisdom begins. Not in denying change, not in outrunning it, but in recognizing its presence, walking alongside it, and learning how to live with it instead of against it. And if you stay with me, not just listening, but really feeling this, you might find that what you've been chasing all along isn't somewhere out there. It's here, in this breath, this heartbeat, this passing, irreplaceable moment. And it all starts by seeing the unseen truth. Impermanence matters, not because it takes things from you, but because it reveals to you what truly matters. And once you see that, everything else begins to fall quietly, beautifully into place. There's a deeper layer to this, one we often overlook. It isn't just the world around you that's in constant motion. It's you, your thoughts, your moods, your desires, even the very sense of who you are. Like clouds drifting across a vast sky, always appearing, shifting, and dissolving. And when you begin to observe this closely, something remarkable happens. A clarity rises, and you start to notice how your suffering isn't caused by change itself, but by your resistance to it. And that, my friend, is where freedom begins. The ancient ones didn't just teach impermanence to scare people into renouncing life. They spoke of it to open a doorway, to invite you into a different way of being, one where peace doesn't rely on things staying the same, but on you learning to move gracefully with the flow of change. So if you're ready, if you've grown weary of chasing permanence in a world made of smoke and mirrors, let's step a little deeper. Let's peel back the layers. Because once you truly understand how impermanence works, not as an idea, but as a lived experience, the way you see yourself, your relationships, and this strange, beautiful life will never be the same again. Ready? Let's begin. Close your eyes for a moment and think about this. How many things in your life have truly stayed the same? The face you see in the mirror, the people you once called home, the emotions that once consumed you so completely you thought they'd never leave. Everything has shifted, softly, subtly, sometimes violently, and whether you noticed or not, it happened anyway. This is where one of the most profound teachings in Buddhist philosophy quietly unfolds: Anicca, a word ancient in sound, yet eternal in meaning. It isn't just a term to memorize or a concept to casually admire. It's the very pulse of existence. Anicca means impermanence, but to call it merely impermanence feels too small. It's not just about things coming and going. It's about the truth that everything from galaxies to heartbeats, from mountains to the thoughts crossing your mind right now, exists in a state of constant, unstoppable flux. Nothing, and I mean nothing, remains unchanged. Not even you. You are not the same person you were 5 years ago. You are not the same person you were yesterday. And by the time this sentence finishes, you will already have shifted in countless ways you can't even detect. This law of change doesn't ask for your permission. It doesn't wait for your readiness. It moves through your life like an invisible current, shaping every joy, every sorrow, every rising hope, and every inevitable loss. And yet most of us live as if this law didn't exist. We make promises to ourselves. When I have this, I'll finally be happy. We cling to moments, desperately trying to hold them in place. We attach labels to people, hoping they'll never change, praying situations will stay the same. But life, it has other plans. And this isn't meant to be cruel. The river doesn't apologize for its flow. The wind doesn't seek permission before shifting the clouds. They simply move because that is their nature. The Buddha's genius wasn't in inventing this truth. It was in seeing it so clearly, so deeply, that he could no longer pretend otherwise. And he realized it isn't the changing that causes us pain. It's our refusal to accept it. When you resist the natural law of change, you suffer. When you cling to what was or frantically chase what might be, you miss the only thing that was ever real. This fleeting, unrepeatable moment. The ancient texts describe the nature of Anicca with imagery that still stirs something inside. A dewdrop trembling on a leaf, a candle flickering in a drafty room, a shooting star carving a line of light through the night sky. Brief, beautiful, gone. And in their impermanence lies their beauty, because if that dewdrop stayed forever, you'd stop seeing it. If the candle never flickered, its flame would feel ordinary. If that star never faded, you wouldn't wish for anything when it crossed the sky. So much of life's meaning, its aching beauty, exists because things end. It isn't a flaw in the design. It's the very point. Now, imagine for a moment if you could truly grasp this law not just in your mind but in your bones. If you could look at a frustrating moment, a fleeting joy, a heartbreak, a success, and see it for what it is. A passing wave in the endless ocean of becoming. How different would your days feel? How much lighter would your heart be? The wisdom of Anicca whispers to you in every experience. It invites you to stop fighting the current and to learn how to swim with it. Not because you're giving up, not because you don't care, but because you understand nothing is fixed. And in that fluidity lies both your greatest challenge and your deepest liberation. It means your sorrow won't last forever. It means your victories will humble you. It means that what you fear most will pass, and what you cherish most must be loved now, in this fragile instant, before it too transforms. It doesn't mean you shouldn't love, it means you should love more fiercely, more honestly, more awake, because it won't last. And that is the tender miracle of being alive. So the next time you feel the ache of change, remember, you are not alone in this. Every blade of grass, every galaxy, every unseen atom is shifting with you. And perhaps within that great tide of impermanence, you'll find a strange kind of peace. Not the kind built on control, but the kind born from release. Let it go. Let it come. Let it be. Because whether you do or not, it already is. There's a reason the old teachers would meditate on the image of a corpse. It wasn't morbid. It was a way to remember the truth of Anicca, that all form dissolves, and in its dissolving it gives way to something else. And it's not about despair. It's about seeing life's truest form. The ungraspable, endlessly moving river we've always been a part of. And when you start to see that movement, not as an enemy, but as your oldest companion, a new kind of wisdom stirs. A wisdom that knows how to hold life loosely, to laugh with it, to grieve with it, to love it with open, unguarded hands, and perhaps most importantly, to wake up here and now. So let's step closer to this wisdom, not in theory but in the texture of your daily life. Because if everything changes, how should we live? How should we love? How should we let go? There's a deeper way to move through this world. And it begins with seeing clearly what you're standing in. There's something deeply unsettling about watching things slip through your fingers, a love that fades, a body that ages, a certainty that unravels, and perhaps the most unsettling of all is the quiet suspicion that you, too, are not as solid as you once believed. We spend so much of our lives constructing a self, layer by layer, story by story. We collect names, titles, memories, fears, preferences. And somewhere along the way, we start to believe that this collection, this ever-growing scrapbook of experiences and labels, is who we truly are. But what if it is? What if the you cling to is no different than a cloud passing through an empty sky, a form appearing for a time, only to dissolve, reshape, and move on? This is the unsettling, liberating, beautiful heart of the Buddha's teaching. There is no fixed self, not because you are nothing, but because you are not a thing. You are a process, a verb, not a noun, a river, not a rock. And if Anicca, impermanence, is the pulse of the universe, then your so-called self is no exception. The ancient texts call it anatta, the doctrine of no self. And at first, it feels like a kind of death sentence to the ego, the part of you that wants to be important, remembered, defined, eternal. But it isn't a death sentence. It's a key, a quiet, precious key that unlocks the cage you didn't even realize you were in. Think about it. The anger you felt 5 years ago, where is it now? The heartbreak you thought would crush you, what shape has it taken today? The opinions you held so fiercely, how many have softened, flipped, or faded into silence? What if the one constant in all those changes wasn't a static you, but the very flow of experience itself? A candle flickers, its flame dances. Smoke rises, then disappears. Was the flame ever a fixed thing? Or was it always just movement? And if you too are movement, what would it mean to stop clinging to fixed identities? To release the desperate grasping at this is who I am, this is what I need, this is what I must become. Would it feel terrifying? At first, yes. The mind is terrified of its own transparency. But then, quietly, softly, freedom begins to bloom. If there's no fixed self, there's no fixed limitation, no label you must carry, no story you're condemned to repeat. You aren't chained to a past version of yourself. You aren't confined to a future you fear. You are fluid, emerging, vanishing, becoming. The Buddha taught that suffering arises when we cling to what is impermanent. And what do we cling to more desperately than the idea of me? We fight to protect it, defend it, prove it, inflate it, escape it. And yet it's as ungraspable as mist. A person insults you and anger flares. Why? Because it threatens the self you think you are. You succeed at something and pride surges. Why? Because it reinforces the self you've been trying to build. But in both moments, you are at the mercy of illusion. Now imagine this. What if the self was just a temporary gathering of conditions, like a wave rising on the surface of the sea? The wave isn't separate from the ocean. It appears, it moves, it dissolves. And not for a single instant is it a fixed thing. When you see yourself this way, when you see through the illusion of a permanent self, an unexpected peace arrives. The anger loses its sharpness. The craving softens. The fear fades. Because what is there to defend, really? What is there to grasp so tightly when all is movement, including the one grasping? And this isn't about annihilation. It's not about becoming nothing. It's about seeing that you are not one thing. You are everything passing through awareness. A thought arises. A feeling moves. A memory visits. A sensation flickers. Each appearing, each fading. And behind them all is awareness itself, unmoving. Unclinging, untroubled, like an open sky. Clouds form, storms rage, sunlight streams, but the sky remains. Unstained, unafraid. And perhaps this awareness, this silent, boundless knowing, is closer to your true nature than any story you've told yourself. When you see impermanence, you see the absence of a permanent self. And when you see the absence of self, you touch the edge of true freedom. Freedom from the exhausting game of constant self-definition. Freedom from defending your ego. Freedom from the stories that suffocate your joy. And what's left is presence. A tender, direct, unfiltered encounter with life as it is, before the mind scrambles to name it. A sunset isn't beautiful because you call it so. It's beautiful because it exists, unpossessed. And you too are most beautiful when you stop trying to be someone and allow yourself to be something passing, something alive, something aware. In that letting go, the ache softens, the mask drops, and life in all its impermanence reveals itself not as an enemy to fear, but as a teacher to bow to. And so we continue, moving deeper into this understanding. Because if the self is not what we thought, and if everything we cling to is impermanent, then what does it truly mean to suffer? And why do we grasp so tightly at what we know must slip away? There's something else waiting in the heart of this truth, a deeper wisdom, a gentler kind of freedom, and it begins by looking straight into the nature of suffering itself. Have you ever wondered why, even in the moments you finally get what you wanted, there's still a quiet ache underneath? You land the job, you fall in love, you buy the house, you hold your newborn in your arms. And yet deep in some hidden chamber of your heart, there's a soft, persistent whisper, this won't last. Maybe you ignore it. Maybe you drown it in noise, in plans, in new desires. But it's always there. A truth too honest, too raw to be silenced forever. This, the Buddha said, is Dukkha. Not just suffering in the way we typically imagine, not only heartbreak and illness and loss, but the deeper, quieter tension that hums beneath every human experience. A subtle dissatisfaction that clings to even our sweetest joys, because somewhere inside, we know everything is slipping through our fingers. And what's at the root of this ever-present ache? Impermanence, Anicca, the constant, unstoppable change that reshapes every part of your life, your body, your mind, your relationships, your successes, your sorrows. Nothing you can name, grasp, or hold will remain as it is. The Buddha wasn't condemning life when he spoke of this. He wasn't saying the world is cruel or meaningless. He was simply pointing to what is, to what no one wants to look at, but what everyone eventually must face. And the reason it hurts isn't because life is impermanent. It's because we refuse to accept it. We grasp at what we love. We push away what we fear. We fight to freeze what must move and to escape what inevitably finds us. Aging, change, loss, death. But clinging to what cannot stay and resisting what must come, that's the friction. That's the heat. That's Dukkha. Imagine you're holding a handful of sand at the shore. The tighter you grip, the faster it slips through your fingers. The more you try to trap it, the more you lose. And so it is with life. We hold on to youth, to status, to loved ones, to possessions, to identities. We build castles in the sand, pretending the tide will not rise. And when it does, because it always does, our hearts break. But what if the suffering isn't in the tide, but in the refusal to accept its coming? This is why the Buddha taught not to cling. Not because joy isn't real, not because love isn't beautiful, but because everything in this world by its very nature is a visitor. And the suffering comes when you mistake the visitor for a permanent resident. It's like mistaking a rainbow for a stone bridge you can walk across. When it disappears, you rage. You grieve. You believe something has gone terribly wrong. But the rainbow never betrayed you. It was always meant to fade. Likewise, every joy, every sorrow, every heartbeat, every breath, each one is a moment, a gift, a ripple on the surface of a vast, endless sea. So the question isn't how to stop impermanence. You can't. The question is how to live with it. How to let things rise and fall without being shattered. How to open your hands instead of clenching your fists. And here lies a paradox. When you stop grasping, you suffer less. Not because you care less, but because you love more freely. You see everything for what it is, precious, fleeting, alive. A sunset isn't less beautiful because it fades. It's more beautiful because it does. A relationship isn't less meaningful because one day it will end. It's more sacred because you know it cannot last. Even your own body, your own thoughts, your own name, impermanent, and therefore miraculous. This is not an invitation to despair. It's an invitation to wake up, to stop chasing permanence in a world made of movement, to stop seeking safety in what was never meant to stay. And in doing so, to discover a deeper, quieter kind of happiness, one not built on clinging but on clarity, not on control but on presence. When you understand impermanence, you stop trying to freeze the river, and you start learning how to swim. The ancient masters called it peace within the storm, not because the storm ceases, but because you stop fighting the wind. And perhaps this is what true wisdom is. To live fully, knowing it will pass. To love deeply, knowing it will change. To exist moment by moment, breath by breath, with eyes open to the beauty of everything passing away. So the question now is whether life is impermanent. We know it is. The question is, how do we live knowing that? And within that inquiry lies a deeper secret, because not all suffering is inevitable. Some of it we create. And it begins not with what happens to us, but with how we cling, how we crave, how we resist. Which leads us to something even more intimate than impermanence itself, the root of our craving, the engine of our restlessness. and how to finally, tenderly begin letting go. There's a quiet kind of courage most people never speak of. Not the bold, showy kind that faces battles and storms head-on, but the quieter, invisible bravery it takes to release what you've spent your whole life gripping. To loosen your hold, to unclench your fist, to let go. For so long we've been taught the opposite. Hold on tight. Fight for what you want. Protect what's yours, don't let it slip away. And yet, the tighter we cling, the heavier it becomes. The more we grasp at control, the more life slips through our fingers like fine sand. Remember that handful of sand by the shore. How the tighter you squeeze, the faster it escapes. And how when you open your palm, it simply rests there held by grace, not force. This is the freedom the Buddha spoke of. Not in having, not in owning, not in control, but in letting go. It isn't about denying life's beauty or pretending we don't care. It's about holding things with open hands, with open hearts. About loving so deeply that you no longer need to possess. About living so fully that you're no longer afraid when things change, because they will, and they must. But somewhere in the aching, relentless impermanence of life lies an unexpected mercy. When you stop clinging, you stop suffering. Not because you've numbed yourself, but because you finally see things as they truly are. And what they are is already enough. You see, craving isn't about the object itself. It's about the illusion we weave around it. We believe that having this, achieving that, keeping this person close, holding onto that memory will grant us safety, happiness, meaning. But the deeper truth is, nothing outside of you can ever provide lasting peace. Not because life is cruel, but because everything external is, by nature, shifting, rising, falling, coming and going. When you root your peace in things that change, your peace will change. But when you learn to anchor yourself in the awareness that watches it all, when you become intimate with the silent, witnessing presence within you, you realize you don't have to cling anymore. You can let the waves rise and fall. You can watch the seasons turn, and you can still be whole. Letting go isn't a loss, it's a return. A return to the simple, quiet clarity you were born with, before the world taught you what to fear, what to crave, what to chase. Imagine carrying a heavy stone in your hand, believing it's precious. You grip it tighter every day, though it tires you, though it cuts your skin. Then one day you open your hand and realize it was never gold, just a stone. And the moment you drop it, lightness, relief. Not because the stone changed, but because you did. And this, dear one, is the gift of letting go. It's not something you force, it's something you gently allow. And paradoxically, the more you let go, the more life flows to you. Not because you've claimed it, but because you're no longer in the way. Joy comes uninvited. Peace arrives without effort. Love moves through you like wind through open branches. You start to see the world not as a battlefield to conquer, but as a garden to tend. Not as a possession, but as a passage. And each person you meet, each moment you're given, each joy and sorrow, becomes a sacred guest in the house of your heart. The ancient masters spoke of this so tenderly. They called it the freedom of non-attachment, not coldness, not detachment, but loving, living, experiencing with a heart unburdened by chains. And what you find is, when you stop needing to hold on, you finally start to live. You can savor the sunset without fearing its end. You can fall in love without needing forever. You can cherish each breath, each day, each passing face on the street, knowing it's all a miraculous, unrepeatable gift. This is not passive resignation. It's active, intimate, awake engagement with the truth of things. To let go is to trust life again, to stop demanding that it fit your terms, and to begin meeting it raw, real, and ever-changing as it is. So perhaps now, the invitation isn't to chase happiness, but to release what blocks it, not to fight impermanence, but to flow with it, not to possess, but to love without holding. And when you taste that freedom, even for a moment, you realize it was never about the things you thought you needed to hold. It was always about the space within you, the vast, quiet, open sky of your own awareness, the place where nothing sticks and nothing is lost, the place where you were free all along. And it's here that the ancient path turns toward its deepest promise, not only the ending of suffering, but the uncovering of a peace that nothing can touch. A peace born not from what life gives you, but from what you no longer need to demand. And so, the journey moves forward. Some truths are easy to admire from a distance. Impermanence is one of them. It feels noble, poetic, the kind of wisdom you print on a canvas or tattoo on your skin. Nothing lasts forever. We nod, we sigh, and then we go right back to clinging, to people, to plans, to versions of ourselves we swore we'd outgrown. Why? Because knowing impermanence is one thing, living it is something else entirely. But what if it didn't have to be some lofty, abstract idea? What if you could carry it with you, quietly, tenderly, like a secret in your pocket? Not as a burden, but as a quiet companion to soften your days. That's where daily practice comes in. Not practice in the sense of rehearsing for some distant perfection, but practice in the way a bird practices flight or a river practices surrender. A returning, a remembering. You don't need a monastery. You don't need to abandon your life. You just need small, deliberate moments of waking up. A single conscious breath before your morning coffee. Feel it enter, feel it leave. And notice it never stays. Neither does the next, or the next. Yet you are here. You can watch the warmth of your tea steam into nothing. You can listen to a bird's song knowing it will soon fall silent. You can hold a child's laughter, a lover's hand, a stranger's kindness, without needing to make it last. And in that simple noticing, you meet life as it is, not clinging, not resisting, just being. Imagine walking through your day carrying the awareness that every word you speak might be your last. Not in a morbid way, but in a deeply loving one. How tender your conversations would become. How precious even the ordinary would feel. The crumpled receipt, the cloudy sky, the ache in your chest. Each a small, sacred guest. Each a reminder, this too will pass. So what shall I do with it while it's here? There's a beautiful Japanese concept called mono no aware. It means an awareness of the impermanence of things and a gentle, bittersweet sadness at their passing, but also a deeper appreciation because of it. A cherry blossom is breathtaking because it falls so soon. A summer evening stirs the heart because it fades into dusk. A friend's smile, a parent's voice, a moment of solitude precious because none of it can stay. And you can live like that, not as someone clinging to what must go, but as someone grateful it ever arrived at all. So how do you practice this in daily life? Pause before you react, before you grasp, before you resist. Take a breath, name what's here, name what's leaving, and let it be. When joy visits, don't cage it. When sorrow comes, don't push it away. Both are passing guests, treat them well. At the end of each day, reflect on what you gained and what you lost. Maybe a conversation, maybe a tiny disappointment, maybe an old story about yourself you no longer need to carry. And notice you survived it all. And tomorrow, you'll begin again. This is the quiet, revolutionary practice of living with impermanence, not denying change, but dancing with it. Not fearing endings, but seeing them as part of a larger, mysterious, sacred rhythm. Even grief becomes a softer thing when you know it too will shift. Even ecstasy humbles you when you see its fleeting nature. And in between those peaks and valleys, there's a middle place, a stillness that watches it all. That's the heart of your practice, to witness, to welcome, to release, not because you don't care, but because you finally understand that the beauty was never meant to stay, It was meant to be noticed. And in that noticing, in that daily willingness to let life flow through you rather than possess it, you become free. And what rises in that freedom is something better than control, better than certainty. It's peace. The kind of peace no one can give you and nothing can take away. And perhaps, just perhaps, that's the life you were meant to live all along. And so we arrive here, not at an ending, but at a moment. Another fleeting breath in the endless current of what was, what is, and what will be. We began this journey speaking of impermanence, a word easy to say, harder to live, and nearly impossible to master. But maybe mastery was never the point. Maybe the wisdom of impermanence isn't about control. It's about vision, about seeing things as they truly are, not as we wish them to be. The Buddha called this Anicca not as a punishment but as a gift. Because when you strip away the illusion of permanence, what's left isn't emptiness, it's clarity. You realize that no one and nothing can belong to you, not your possessions, not your youth, not even your own thoughts. Everything arises, everything passes. And in that passing, we glimpse the most radical, liberating truth. Nothing was ever missing. Nothing was ever truly yours to lose. The pain came from pretending otherwise. Impermanence reveals the reality we so often refuse to face, that this life is a river, not a stone. That joy and sorrow, gain and loss, birth and death, are not separate events but threads of the same fabric. To cling to one and reject the other is to tear yourself apart. But when you stop resisting, when you stop demanding that life be different from what it is, a great quiet enters, a peace not born of having what you want but of understanding what you have. And in that peace, something extraordinary happens. You fall in love with reality, not the fantasy, not the flawless version you built in your head, but the raw, imperfect, breathtaking, vanishing moment you are living right now. This, dear listener, this is freedom. To love without possessing, to grieve without drowning, to celebrate without clinging. To walk this strange, beautiful path knowing every step is both the arrival and the farewell. And so, as you leave this moment, and you will take this truth with you, everything changes. And because everything changes, everything matters. Every word you speak, every act of kindness, every time you choose compassion over cruelty, presence over distraction, gratitude over greed, they ripple outward. They shape the world you will one day leave behind. This is what it means to live awake, not detached but deeply engaged, not indifferent but endlessly curious, to marvel at the cherry blossom because it will fall, to treasure a child's laugh because it will fade, to hold this life, your fragile, fierce, flickering life, like a candle in the wind, and know it was always meant to be this brief. If this journey moved you, if it made you pause, breathe, reflect, then I invite you to walk further with us. Subscribe to the channel, not because algorithms demand it, but because somewhere in the noise of this world, there are voices still speaking of things that matter, of silence, of impermanence, of the beautiful, unbearable truth of being human. Leave a comment below, share what impermanence means to you, or simply say hello. We are, after all, fleeting travelers on the same road. And if you feel this message could soften another's burden, lighten another's grief, or awaken another's heart, share this video. It might be the very thing someone was waiting to hear. Until our paths cross again. Be well, be kind, and remember, nothing lasts. And that's what makes it precious.